Talk Radio.
Welcome to Awake to Oneness Radio. I am Caroline Chang, your host. The mission of Awake to Oneness Radio is to inspire the world to awaken to the universal truth of oneness. Science is teaching us that all life is interconnected, that all interconnected and interdependent. All matter has life within it, and it's all connected. And also, spirituality and ancient wisdom has been teaching us this truth of oneness for eons. And so when what you do to another person, you're literally doing to another aspect of yourself. And when mankind awakens to the truth of oneness, there will be peace on earth. Today's show topic is Physicians' Untold Stories with Dr. Scott Kolbaba. We'd like to welcome Dr. Scott to Awake to Oneness Radio. Welcome, Dr. Scott.
Thanks, Caroline. It's great to be here.
Well, thank you. It's great to have you with us. So please share with our listeners your journey and how you came about to write this wonderful book, Physicians' Untold Stories.
Well, Carolyn, I'm a general internist in a little suburb of Chicago. I've been doing medicine for about 35 years. It's hard for me to believe that. And I love what I do. But I started to have some interesting experiences that I really couldn't explain. And about the same time, a few doctors came to me, and they had some amazing stories that I really also couldn't explain. One of them was a doctor by the name of Steve Heim. Steve Heim is a orthopedic surgeon, trauma surgeon. He does a lot of spine cases locally. I know him very, very well. And we were having breakfast one morning, and he said, "You've got to listen to this story. I just can't explain it." And I'm so moved. He just came back from a vacation, and where he had this occurrence. And he said he was skiing with his wife and his wife's sister, and they were skiing on a mountain that they'd not been on before. And he's an expert skier. And they were skiing down the mountain when a blizzard hit, and they couldn't see anything in front of them. The temperature dropped. They could hardly navigate where they were going, and they came to a patch of trees in the middle of this path. They had to go to the right or the left. And so Steve went to the right, and the girls went to the left. And as soon as Steve realized that they were separated, he decided to ski back through the 5 feet of powder snow in this patch of woods and get back to where the girls were. And all of a sudden, he said everything became quiet. The wind was swirling around him, but it was just very, very quiet, and it was eerie. And he had this overwhelming feeling that he was being called upon to do something that had life and death implications, and he had no idea what he was doing. And so he just stopped right in the middle of the woods. He took off his skis and stood there for a minute, not knowing quite what to do, but he still had this feeling of overwhelming dread, and it was very quiet despite the snow and the wind. And he decided to climb up the mountain in the opposite direction of where the girls were waiting. So he had no idea what he was doing. He was climbing and walking and climbing and walking, and he came to a large pine tree. And there's a tree well which goes down to the base of the tree and then goes up to the 5 feet of snow. And he looked down into the tree well, and he suddenly realized why he was there. Underneath the tree was a body covered with snow. He decided he's a trauma surgeon, so he decided to brush off the face to see if he could tell if he was breathing or if he was alive. And he looked like he was dead. He couldn't tell if he was breathing. But Steve, being a trauma surgeon, decided to put his hand on his carotid artery, and sure enough, he had a pulse. So he realized he was alive. He suddenly went into trauma mode. He put his head down. He covered him up. He brushed the snow off, covered him up with his jacket, started yelling for help. And one of the last skiers down the mountain heard his cry for help and came to his side and said, "What can I do?" Steve said, "Go to the nearest phone, call the ski patrol, and get him up here as soon as possible. This person's almost dead." So about 15, 20 minutes later, he saw the ski patrol coming up with a gurney behind a snowmobile. They loaded this unconscious, hypothermic, shocky skier onto the gurney and took him down to the waiting ambulance at the lodge, and they took him off to the hospital. Steve then was shivering with adrenaline and also with cold, and decided to go back to where the girls were. They were still actually waiting for him, and they then skied down the rest of the mountain and came back to the lodge. The next day, Steve called the hospital to find out what had happened to this individual, and they said, you did a great job splinting his leg. Steve did that in the field with some underclothes and some a tree branch, and the fellow was alive. He was speaking and lived. And Steve then said to me, after that experience, I realized that there's something else out there. There's something upstairs, he called it, that looks out for all of us and connects, as you mentioned, Caroline, connects all of us together, and that he was just summoned to rescue this person. And he said, there's something else up there. He called it the man upstairs.
Right.
And so I heard that story, and plus some of the other stories that I had experienced myself. And I thought, maybe I should write this down. And doctors, like many people, like many that serve the public, like a barber, for example, I have lots of patients that do all kinds of occupations. I've got publishers of books, I've got plumbers, I've got doctors and dentists, and you name it. So I called one of my book publishers, and I said, can I have lunch with you sometime? I'd like to talk about some stories I have to see if you really think they might be worth writing about. So we went to lunch, and we were sitting there, and I was really hungry, so I was eating and didn't look up while I was telling my stories. And after about two of these stories, I looked up, and he had tears in his eyes. And that really shook me up, and I said, I didn't know what to say, actually, at that point. And he said to me, you have to publish these stories. You have to write them down. So that was the beginning, and I started writing the stories down, and then I started asking other doctors for their stories. And what I would do would be to hang out in the doctor's lounge, which is a wonderful place where doctors congregate to get the donuts and the coffee and everything else that is in the doctor's lounge. And I would say, do you have any stories about things that you can't explain scientifically? And many doctors did. I probably interviewed about 200 doctors, and many of them had stories that were really pretty interesting stories. And the criteria that I used to include in my book were if the story brought me to tears, not because it was sad, but just because it was emotionally moving, or if it gave me goosebumps, I'd include that story in the book. And that's pretty much what I did. I thought it would be a 6-month project. It turned out to be almost 4 years of writing and revising, and lawyers and editors and so forth, and publishers. So, but I finally got it done. I've never written a book before, but it's gotten some nice reviews, and I think there's some things that have helped people realize that there's something else out there, and that doctors realize that even though they don't talk about it.
Right. Wow. And it's amazing because, in truth, for me, it's a knowing. It's not a belief that there's something else greater than ourselves. And when I say ourselves, because in essence, it is. We're not separate. See, right. We're raised in society and in church, and just in general, we're raised to think that we're separate from God, from the divine, from the universe, when we're not. We're not separate, and we can never be separate. So we're a part of God, and so we are a part of all these wonderful things that happen. Actually, you're in Chicago, but if you were in Philadelphia in 2011, there would be another story that I'm sure my son's physician, doctor at the time, could have shared with you, because his exact words to me was he couldn't. It was just completely unexplainable what we experienced. My son was on life support for 5 weeks. And,
I read about your story. That's an amazing story.
Yeah, he was on life support for 5 weeks, and I was told that he wasn't going to live. And the reason the doctors thought he wasn't going to make it, not because of his heart condition, he did have a very weak heart, but at the time he was admitted that time for pneumonia. and they thought because his heart was so weak that he could not recover from the pneumonia. And they had, asked me, it was December 7th, 2011, if they could take him off life support. And I said no. But I just said no, don't take him off. And in the back of my mind, I just said no way. I am not burying my son. I'm just not doing it. And so I had gone upstairs on a different floor where there was this quiet little waiting room where no one ever was. So when I wanted really some alone time, because I was living in the hospital for 5 weeks. I was living in the ICU
I'm
unit,
sure you were.
and because I lived 2 hours away, so it wasn't a matter of me being able to go back and forth every day. But I went upstairs to this quiet waiting room where no one ever was, and I didn't have anything but over-the-counter sleeping pills, a whole bottle. And I said, okay, I wrote the note, okay, I'm not going to bury my son. My son is going to bury me. And I took the bottle of sleeping pills. And I pretty much was asleep for 2 days. Someone did find me. I remember being in the ER. I remember being, in the ICU myself. And I remember his doctor, my son's doctor, saying to me, when I was in ICU, that Kyle needed me. I remember that very clearly. But in essence, when I did get better and they moved me to a regular room, I was under 24-hour suicide watch. So and I could only visit with Kyle for about an hour. They let me visit with Kyle in where he was, and one day I'll never forget. The last day I visited him under supervision, I whispered in his ear. I got close to him because I'm short, and they had him way high up. He's tall. He's like 6'3", and the bed they had him. The bed was just elevated, so I had to pretty much stand on a step stool to get close to his ear, and he's still on life support and everything. And so I get close to his ear, and I whisper in his ear, "Kyle, get better so we can both go home." And that night, that was December 14th, so that was exactly a week after they had told me that he wasn't going to live. That night, he pulled himself off. When a patient is incubated and on life support, they have them semi-sedated. So even though he was semi-sedated, he pulled out the vent. And when he did that, they thought, oh, my God, they'd have to put it back in. But they didn't have to put it back. And they realized he was breathing fine on his own.
That's amazing.
And then he, within the next few hours, he pulled out the feeding tube. He pulled out the ventilator and pulled out the feeding tube. And the doctors said it was like he never even had pneumonia. The recovery was that miraculous. So it was like he never was sick from the pneumonia. So, and he and I, my son and I, went home December 30th, just before New Year's Eve that year.
Wow. So, what a story.
Yes.
What a story.
Yes.
Those things happen.
Yes.
They happen all the time. That's neat.
So experiencing that made me even more grounded in my knowing that, that there is a God, but there also that everything is divinely interconnected and is happening in divine order. So I made a promise that from that day, when I brought my son home that day, that I would never forget that miracle. And I will always, always, for the rest of my life, be thankful for that miracle. So when he did transition, my son made his transition 2.5 years later, I still, when he did transition, I just was thanking God. I was at peace. I knew that it was his soul who decided this was his time, but I knew he wasn't God. because the people that, they're not gone. Though our loved ones that transition from this life are still with us. Matter of fact, they're with us even more, because when they're in the physical, and Kyle was 29 years old, and he had his friends, he had his life. Matter of fact, for 10 years, he didn't live at home. He was living his own life. He called me on Mother's Day and on my birthday,
Sure.
But he wasn't with me all the time. Now that he is in spirit, I know he's with me all the time. So
funny things happen that that you can't explain, and I think people, that's one of the number of the stories in my book are about people that have passed that then come back and participate in our lives. And there's a number I can think of. There's one interesting one. One of my favorites. My editor thought it wasn't my best, but it was one of my favorites. It's a dime story. It's about a fellow that was in the emergency room, and the emergency room doctor examined him. He had some abdominal symptoms and abdominal pain. And when he was examining him, he found a tattoo of a dime on his arm. And he said, "That's an interesting tattoo." He couldn't help but ask him, what that means. And he said, "Well, my son collects coins, and his favorite coin was a dime. And whenever we go to a special function or a special place, like the Cubs game, for example, here in Chicago, he pulls up the chair and there's a dime underneath the chair. Or if we go to a nice restaurant or a favorite place, he'll find a dime." And he's collected these dimes. And he said, "My son was killed in an automobile accident on the expressway, and ever since then I've missed him badly. But I started finding dimes too." And I said, I know that he looks out for me and leaves dimes in places where I'll find them. And so I had this tattoo put on my arm so that he would know that I know that he is still communicating with me. And the ER doc thought that was an interesting story, but couldn't quite buy the whole thing. And the individual got better in the ER. They gave him some antibiotic and sent him on his way. And then the ER doc went back to dictate the note in the doctor's lounge where only the doctors go, and he pulled out the chair. On the floor, he saw something bright, looked down, it was a dime. So he said, thanks, a little prayer to himself, "Thanks for helping me believe." And that was Robbie's way of he thinks, of communicating with him, and helping his dad get to the right place. So I think there are things like that happen all the time, little things that you don't expect or don't realize until you really think about it.
Exactly. It's so true. That is so true. I mean, Kyle has communicated with me many times, and it's like you said, it's paying attention to it, not thinking, "Oh, that's just coincidence," because there are no such things as coincidence. And when you brush it off, thinking, "Oh, it's just a coincidence," that's when Spirit is communicating with you. Yes, that is so true. Share more, please, of the stories that are. But I love that one because I know that I have a symbol too that I know when Kyle is communicating with me. It's not dimes. Recently, before he passed, he had bought a car, a GMC car, and you know how they have that big GMC on the front and on the back, and I know and I see them all the time, and whenever I see a GMC car, I know that's Kyle's way of communicating, letting me know, "Mom, I'm with you." So,
Well, one of the first things that I had happened to me was on a vacation in Cape Cod that got me really interested in pursuing some of these spiritual things. And I love to take my kids on vacation. My parents did that with us, and we loved vacations when I was a kid, and I've been taking my kids on vacation for a long time. And it's funny that when the dad pays, most of the kids can make it. It's a funny thing that happens like that. So we were in Cape Cod, which is one of our favorite places, and we have about 18 at the time. And the boys like to cook, so we were cooking this particular dinner. And when we went out to buy some all the supplies and everything, we happened to see some pies, and we bought 5 pies because we thought that would be the amount that we would need. And they were cherry pies at the grocery store. And we began to talk about our favorite pies, and we all decided that Grandma Kolbaba, my mother, who had died a number of years before that, loved to make rhubarb pie, and we had a big rhubarb plant in the back of the yard, and she'd pick all the rhubarb stalks at the end of the season, and then she'd make this incredibly sweet, wonderful rhubarb pie. And when we'd come to visit, we'd all sneak into the kitchen. I'm sure she knew that we were sneaking into the kitchen. And with germ theory aside, we'd take spoons and go right into the pan and eat the cherry pie, and everyone would get as much as they could eat. And we loved it, and you couldn't eat very much because it was so sweet. And we all thought that if Grandma was here, she would make us a rhubarb pie. Okay. So we went back and we had the dinner. We had swordfish steaks and corn on the cob, and it was really a delicious dinner. And it was one of those evenings. There are some times in your life when you can remember that particular day as a day that you had to pinch yourself. It was so perfect. And this was one of those days. Everyone was having fun. We just had come from the beach. It was a beautiful sunset. We were sitting down eating wonderful food. Even though the boys cooked it, it was absolutely delicious. And I kept thinking, I wonder if my mom could ever. It's too bad she couldn't be here to be part of this incredible family, just a wonderful, good feeling family evening. And my wife then served the cherry pie, and I took a bite, and it wasn't cherry; it was rhubarb. I looked back at the box. The box said cherry, but it was rhubarb pie. Now, you can say that the pie may have been mixed up in the factory or lots of things, but I know that at that time, my mother was enjoying an evening with us in Cape Cod that was an unforgettable family evening. And that's one of the things that first got me interested in pursuing some of these ideas. And then when the doctors started to come to me with stories, I thought I've got to write these down, and that ultimately became the book, Physicians' Untold Stories.
Yes. Oh, wow. Yes. It's so true, because they are with us. When we think, when we think that they're not, they try to the best way that they can communicate to let us know, no, I'm still here. I see exactly what's going on. I know exactly what's going on. One of my recent guests was Dr. Soul phone. Why can't Gary Schwartz. He is developing the soul phone, where within, I can't say how many years, but soon we'll be able to actually communicate with our loved ones on the other side. And this I know because I've only had one reading. I knew I wanted to have a reading after Kyle passed and transitioned, but I didn't. I was waiting. I wasn't searching. I was waiting for the perfect medium to meet, the perfect medium to have. And so I had one on my show, and I knew she was the one. And she gave me a reading on Kyle's birthday. And Kyle's voice actually is on that tape from that reading a few months ago in November of this past November. Kyle's voice is literally on the tape. And so it's like, wow. He was actually trying to speak through her computer. It was so amazing. Yes.
Strange things happen, don't they? Well, I think it's
so
reassuring to have that.
Yeah, she's working with Dr. Gary Schwartz, who is working on developing the soul phone. And so yes. Yes. So you'll be able to actually call your mother and tell her how much you enjoyed the pie that day.
The rhubarb pie.
Yes. That is how things are quickly evolving, and we are, shifting to that place where we're actually be able to communicate with our loved ones. Yes, that is amazing. So, some more favorites. Share some more favorites from your book.
Well, you talked about coincidences, and one of the main themes, there are a number of themes that occur in a book, and you don't even quite know what the themes are until you actually get the stories assembled and together, because I just collected stories that were moving to me, and then eventually the book seems to take a life of its own. And one of the main themes is that coincidences happen all the time, and they're really not coincidental. and pay attention to your coincidences. And I've had many people who read the book come back to me and say, oh, yeah, now I realize that some of those things that have happened to me were not coincidental. They actually helped me to achieve what I was trying to achieve. And I'm the same way. Until I wrote this book, I had some coincidences that were pretty spectacular that I just had written off. And one of those was one that allowed me to get into medical school. I was a economics and art major in college, of all things. I was initially pre-med and changed in somewhere in the middle of college. And so when I graduated, I was happy I didn't have to go to any school anymore. But after about a year, I decided I better get back to what I really wanted to do, and that is medicine. So I had to take some prerequisites. And I'd been doing this for a couple of years, and I decided that I was having a family at the time. I would have to get into school to get organic chemistry, which was my one prerequisite that I needed, or I couldn't get into medical school. And if I didn't get it this year, I'd have to get a regular job, start working, and support my family. So this was the year I had to get into organic chemistry. Otherwise, I couldn't pursue my medical ideas any further. And so there were two schools at night that offered organic chemistry, since I had some job during the day. And one was Aurora University, and I worked in Aurora, which was great. That's one of the western suburbs of Chicago. The other one was at Roosevelt University downtown. So I enrolled in Aurora University. I went to the bookstore. There were tons of books there, and I thought, oh, this is great. There's going to be a big class. And I went to the first night's class, and there were 3 students in the class. And then I thought, well, maybe we'll have some personal attention. Well, the professor came in and said, I'm sorry, we're going to close the class because there aren't enough students. So I was panicked, thinking I'd never get into medical school. Then I realized I could zip down to Roosevelt downtown and enroll there. So I did that the next day. I made some lame excuse to my boss, went down there and stood in line for the registrar. And when I got to the front of the line, I said, I'd like to enroll in organic chemistry. I understand you offer that night. And she said, well, we do. We have one full class. We offered a second class. We opened up, and that's full. And now we have about 10 students on the waiting list. And I said, well, you don't understand. If I don't go into organic chemistry, I'll be a failure in life. I won't go into medical school and so forth. And she said, I'm very sorry, but every one of those students on the waiting list has the same story. And so I felt terrible, and I said, it was a desperate time, and I said, who makes the ultimate decision about who gets into the class? And she said, that's the professor. So I said, well, where's the professor located right now? And she said, up on the 3rd floor. So I ran up to the 3rd floor, and there was a waiting room of students, probably doing the same thing I was trying to do, but I must have looked really sad to the secretary there. So she said, if you want to just talk with the professor for 2 minutes, you can wait in the anteroom. He's meeting with the other professor teaching the organic chemistry class. So I waited in the little room right outside the door of the class where the 2 professors were talking. And the doors were paper thin, so I didn't intend to hear, but I heard everything that was going on. And the professors were talking about how they had no books. They called to the publisher, they called all the local universities, and they had enough books for the first class. But the second class, when they opened up, they had no books. And they were in a real bind because this class started the next day. So the professors finally completed their discussion, and the one left, and the other one signaled for me to come in. He looked very bored, and I said, I need to get in organic chemistry because I'm going to be a failure in life if I don't, and so forth. He said, I'm sorry, class is filled. Everyone else that's trying to get in has the same story. He shook my hand and saw me out. And then I realized this was a time for desperate measures because this was my life flashing in front of me here. If I didn't do this, I would not be a doctor. So I said to him, I understand you're looking for books for organic chemistry. And his eyebrows suddenly went up, and he looked like he was a lot more interested in me all of a sudden. And I said, if I can get you some books, will you let me in the class? And he looked very interested at that point, and I could feel my heart beating because this was my life on the line, I think. And he said, there was a little bit of a pause. He said, can you get me 30? And my heart was beating in my throat. And I said, more. And he looked at me, and there was a long pause, and my heart was beating harder and harder. And finally he said, you're in. I made it. I told him where the books were. I told him everything that he needed to do to get the books. They got the books. I got into the class. I graduated and then got into medical school just because of that. Now, when you think about that, what about coincidences? What's the likelihood of a person being in that very spot, listening to those 2 professors, talking about a problem that only I could solve, and only they could solve my problem at that time. That is more than coincidental.
Right.
And for most of my life, I wrote it off as a coincidence, but I think that was more than a coincidence. That was some divine hand there that wanted to guide me into what I was doing.
Exactly.
And it's interesting, when I talk with doctors about their careers and about how they got into medical school and those kinds of things, this is not an unusual occurrence, that there are lots of funny coincidences that happen to people, I'm convinced, that have a good intention, that are trying to do something good. I think there's a divine hand that reaches down and helps us and guides us in the things that we're intending to do. And I think I didn't realize that until I wrote the book, but I think that's what happened in this circumstance.
That is so very true. Our higher self, I call it our higher self, because it's just a small piece of us that are here in this embodiment. The larger part of us, our higher self, that is guiding our life, does this, what we call coincidence, all the time. And a lot of times we don't see them. We don't follow them. Or even, we all know when we get inspiration to follow our passion, to do something that really feels exciting. But most of the time, what happens, we let our mind tell us, you can't do it, So that is just following the breadcrumbs that our higher self is putting there out for all of us in every moment. And if we open our eyes and just follow them, we'll be fine. But we have to trust in that, because when it's about trusting and following divine guidance, which is coming from our higher self.
I think so.
Amazing. Now I was just going to say we did have a caller that had a question, but now he or she is gone. So I was going to ask if you were interested in taking questions. But,
absolutely.
Okay. Well, we'll see if the caller calls back. But no, that is a fascinating story on how you got into the class, which got led you to this career. And I loved when you said in the very beginning that you love what you do. So you're meant to. Yes. You're totally meant. And that's what I teach piano lessons. And I've been teaching piano now for over 25 years. And I tell my students, and I have students from the ages of 4 to 16, that you do what you love and you never have to work a day in your life.
That's true.
Yes, follow your heart, follow your passion. Very good.
Well, there's another doctor. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
There's another doctor that had a similar kind of occurrence. John Showalter is his name. He's a hand surgeon. And Dr. Showalter is a very bright guy, and he got into the University of Iowa for residency. And he did a 5-year residency at the university. Well, he initially did his medical school at University of Iowa, wanted to get into the residency there, which is a 5-year residency for hand surgery. But evidently, for some reason, they just took a few students, and he didn't get in. So he said that was one of the greatest disappointments in his life, that he didn't get into the school that he loved. But he did get into the University of Indiana. Now, it was interesting that the University of Indiana at the time was one of the 2 schools in the whole nation that offered a course and offered a program in what's called microsurgery. Microsurgery is where you use a microscope to do very fine surgical techniques, sew together tiny little nerves and blood vessels and things like that you couldn't see really and couldn't do the procedure if you didn't have a microscope. And so he found that was fascinating to him at the University of Indiana. And he ultimately went into that as a career. He went into microsurgery, and he found that he was the first one in the Chicagoland area to do what's called a hand reimplantation. There was a young fellow that took a skill saw through his forearm at one of the factories, and they...
Yeah.
Can you imagine? Yeah.
Yeah. Ouch.
And
the thought
that
of it.
ouch.
Yeah, that's a big ouch.
It was a big ouch. The ER docs knew that Dr. Showalter had the skill to reimplant a hand, although no one had done it in Illinois before. So they called him up and said, "Are you interested in taking this guy on?" And he said, "Sure, send him over." So they brought him over to the hospital by ambulance with the hand on ice, and he took 17 hours and he reattached the hand, the first one that was done here in Illinois. Had he not taken that class and got into the residency program at the University of Indiana, he would never have been able to do that. And he made his whole career out of microsurgery. He loved it. And he said, "Sometimes the greatest disappointments in my life turn out to be the greatest blessings." Getting into the University of Indiana was the greatest blessing he could have had, because he learned a career that he absolutely loved, and he felt that he was guided into that area, into that career for a reason, and indeed he was. And he became a very, very successful surgeon doing microsurgery. So it's interesting that I think that we get divine help from above when we are. Sometimes when we don't even realize it, and sometimes it turns our greatest disappointments into our greatest blessings.
Well, the thing is, I think I'm in the middle of writing an article or a blog that is going to become a part of my book about what you just said. What's true for everyone, and this is hard for a lot of people to understand. All of our challenges, all of our disappointments are our greatest blessing. And every challenge and every disappointment, if we look at it a different way, it turns out to be our greatest blessing. And I
think we learn from those things too.
Yes.
Obviously.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It is so true, and that was a perfect example of how a disappointment can be our greatest blessing. And I am actually writing a chapter in my book about that right now. So
interesting.
That's amazing. Yes.
That's interesting.
Yes.
It's fun to talk with the docs because, doctors don't talk to each other like this ever. Right. And they talk about, what was your last gallbladder case, and, you've got a person with an interesting heart condition and whatever. But rarely do doctors talk about spiritual things or the kinds of things that I talked about in the book. And it was fun to get doctors to really open up and talk about things that we don't talk about, and to share their inner feelings. And I discovered that most doctors really were quite spiritual, even though many aren't regular attenders of church or whatever. They have a great spiritual sense. Dr. Heim, for example, who did the Save the Skier, doesn't admit to having an organized religion, but is very spiritual and very, very attuned to, I think, things the divine hand in our lives. So that was kind of interesting to learn. Also learned that doctors, what I call I called it in the book, do-gooders. Most doctors are in the business that they're in to help someone in the world, to change a life, to make a difference. And I had one doctor, for example, that we were talking on the floor about adopting, and we've adopted a couple of kids ourselves, and we had this little girl in Romania that we found out about that had burned feet because she got too close to a space heater at night when she was wearing plastic shoes, and they melted on her feet and caused all kinds of deformity and burns, and she'd probably never walk again. And I was just telling Dr. Andy Rao, who's a local cardiologist, that it's too bad that no one will ever adopt her and she'll probably never walk again. And about a week later, I got a call from Andy, and he said, Scott, I talked with my wife about this little girl you told me about that can't walk. We'd like to adopt her. And I said, Andy, you know nothing about her. You don't know whether she has other diseases or other conditions, or don't even know what she looks like. And he said, it doesn't matter. She's a girl in trouble. We have the means to help her, and I think we could get surgeons and others to fix her feet and make her a functional person again. And I thought that was an incredible kind of statement and offer. And what surprised me, though, is that many doctors are like that. They would do the same thing. And that, in talking with doctors, that was really reassuring to me that this is a group of doctors that are amazingly spiritual and amazingly kind and generous. So
yes,
it's kind of an eye-opener to me.
Yes.
Doctors sometimes get a bad rating and reputation, but that wasn't the case what I found.
Yeah, I think any doctor that had went in to medicine is for the reason to just want to be a help, to help people, to help others, is really it's I think it's a calling to be a doctor. You know, it's like you said, it was a calling for you, and you love what you do. So it sometimes though you have, I guess, doctors that go into medicine for the wrong reasons. Because, you know, family pressure, you know, your family, but it wasn't their calling. So if it's not, I think that's the difference. If it's not their calling, it's the same thing I was saying to my students, do what you love, and you never work a day in your life. So doctors that are doing what they love to do, they're not, you know, they're serving, and they're doing what they were meant to do, what they came here to do. But then if you do it and it's not your calling, it could be something that you dread doing, and then that's going to show with you know, your colleagues and your patients. You know,
that's true.
So
that's true.
Because like even customer service people, you know, we all run into a customer service person that really should be doing a different job. You know, it's just not meant out for. Yeah, they're not meant out for customer service.
Reminds me of a doctor that I know fairly well. His name is Harold Adolph, and Harold is a surgeon, and he does all kinds of different kinds of surgery, not just a particular specialty. He's kind of a all-around surgeon, and he decided that he wanted to be a missionary surgeon, so he went to Ethiopia to work there, and he wanted to do that for his whole life. And he was one of the few surgeons in Ethiopia that was trained as well as he was. And while he was there, people would be brought in on stretchers from miles and miles around by their families. It's interesting. The families would take turns. They'd have a family of 10 or 15 people, and they would take turns carrying this poor individual on the stretcher for miles and miles and miles to get to him through streams and rivers and all kinds of things. And he did this. He would operate, and some of the cases he had were so life-threatening that he had to operate immediately, otherwise the person would die. So he'd be operating through the night, during the day, and after about 7 months of this, he got burned out. And he just said, I can't do this anymore. And he was a very religious individual, and every morning he would pray. And this particular morning, he prayed that and normally his prayers are very humble, but this morning he was desperate, and he said, Heavenly Father, I have tried to do what I thought was your work, and I'm now tired, and I just simply can't go on. If you can't provide me with a competent surgeon that can take over, this will be my last day. I'll have to leave the mission field and go back home. And so he was in the middle of operating that day, and his wife knocks on the door in the surgical suite, and it's unusual because his wife doesn't like the sight of blood. She would faint when she saw blood. But this time she boldly knocked on the door, and she opened the door, and Harold said, "What can I? What's going on? Why are you here?" And standing next to her was this individual who was kind of rumpled and disheveled and had hair that wasn't well combed, and he suddenly got the feeling that there was something very unusual happening, and he knew what was going on. Harold did, the surgeon. He knew that there was something, that an answer to a prayer. And she said, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Moskowitz, who just came from Brooklyn, New York, from a hospital. He's a surgeon. He's come to help you and take over your practice.
Wow.
And so Harold wanted to say something profound, but all he could muster was, it's nice to meet you. Please, relax, and when I finish the case, we'll talk. Right. And so he said, how did you happen to come at this very time to this hospital in answer to my prayer? And Dr. Moskowitz said, well, I did the scientific method. I had a feeling about a month ago that I needed to go on a mission. And I've always wanted to do that, but I made my mind up about that time, and I didn't know where to go, so I did the scientific thing. I got a map out, I closed my eyes, I spun the map around 3 times and put my finger down and landed on Ethiopia. So I called the airlines, made a reservation to go to Addis Ababa, which is the capital of Ethiopia. And then when I got there, I didn't know where to go, so I looked in the phone book and I called Mission Hospitals, and the person that was in charge of your hospital and several other hospitals said, why don't you go try to see what Harold can put you to do. And it was just a quote coincidence that he ended up at Harold Adolph's hospital. He took over for a month. He did all the surgeries and was a great help for a month. Dr. Adolph took off for a month. Was resting at a resort in Africa.
Right.
Came back after a month, was fully refreshed, was able to take over, and after that, every 6 months he'd take a month off, but that prevented him from being burned out. And he did that for 42 years.
Wow.
And was a very successful missionary and a surgeon in Africa, helping thousands and thousands of people, just because he got an answer to a prayer the same day he asked. So.
Yes. Wow, that's amazing. Yes, it's so true. And like you had said about doctors being spiritual, for me, I say, because I say to people, I don't claim to be any one religion, because I understand the truth of oneness. I understand that we are all one and we're all connected, so there is no division. So if I claim to be something, that's putting some kind of divider between me and others. So, but I have respect. I have the ultimate respect for all religions, because I believe oneness is inclusive of everything. It's inclusive of all religions, of whether you don't believe that there is anything but you're born and you die and there's nothing else. Atheist, whatever your belief. It's all inclusive to oneness. Oneness is there's nothing outside of the oneness, because we're all a part of the oneness.
One of the themes that emerged from my book was that there's something else out there, and that's one of the major themes. That there is this force, a spirit out there that loves us, that looks out for us, that participates in our lives in strange and wonderful ways. And most of our doctors called it God, but I left that open. I didn't do any preaching in the book. I just let that open, and people can believe what they want. But I'm hopeful that people will recognize through these stories from scientists that had very unscientific stories and experiences that show that there is something else to our life. And I think all we need to do is look for it and believe, and that's why we have coincidences that we can't quite explain. That's why something directs us on a path for the good, and it participates in our lives, and helps direct us to a right goal, like Dr. Showalter with his microsurgery, for example.
Yes. Well, what I say on this show all the time, it's about going within. I always say it's not my truth. I've found my truth. I've discovered my truth by going within, and once I've discovered that, then I'm living it. So I encourage everybody to find their own truth, whatever that may be, and I try to encourage people to quiet their mind and just deep breathe, meditate, pray, however, whatever feels right, because we're all unique aspects of the divine, and there's all unique ways of discovering that truth that lies within each of us. So I always say it's not about believing what I say or believing what I believe. It's all about just finding your own truth and living it. So
I think if people search, they will find the truth for them. And that was my hope, that in reading this book, that people would realize there's something else that they need to search for. We're becoming a very secular society where people are giving up any kind of faith, and I'm hopeful that having a bunch of 26 doctor stories of things that you can't quite explain scientifically will help people find that truth for them and help find the divine in their lives.
Yes, and I'm sure when they, when you contacted me, I told you I had my own story, so I knew that the book that you were writing, that you wrote, was full of wonderful stories if I had one, and maybe everyone that reads it, they probably may know of someone that had a story like that to share, or they've experienced one themselves, because it is truly, if we really open ourselves up to seeing beyond the physical, beyond what our eyes and ears can sense and taste and see, and we truly open up, we'll know, we can sense it, we can feel it, even if we can't see it with our human eyes. We'll know it in our heart.
It's interesting when I tell these stories, and frequently I love to tell these stories, and I've got lots of other stories that I've been able to collect since I wrote the book. But I love to tell these stories to my patients, and when I have a patient in the exam room, we'll commonly tell a couple stories. And I usually get behind in my schedule because I do probably too much talking. But it's interesting what happens after I tell a story. Invariably, that person either has had a story of his own or their family has had a story. And I'm convinced that virtually everyone has had a strange coincidence or an amazing story that has happened to them or their family. And I was surprised, one of my first patients that came back with a story told me about an occurrence with his daughter. He was trying to get his daughter into an internship in New York City for about 3 months, and they couldn't find an apartment downtown that was inexpensive enough because they're very, very expensive, and he couldn't afford it. So he was really afraid that she'd have to give up the internship because they couldn't afford the housing. And one night he had a dream about a friend of his that he hadn't seen for about 20 years. And it was a strange dream, but it was, it was an old friend, but they hadn't been in communication for a long, long time. And the next day, interestingly, he got a phone call. And the friend who he had dreamed about called him. And he said, I had a sense I needed to call you and just chat again. It's been a long time. And they reconnected, and they said, my patient said, well, where do you live? And he said, well, I live in downtown in New York. I've been very successful. I started a business. I made lots and lots of money. I was able to retire, and I'm living alone now in this 3-bedroom apartment in downtown New York. And he said, do you think you'd have room for my daughter? And he said, I'd love to. I'd love to show her around, and I'll take care of all the food and lodging and everything. She can have a bedroom. And so, sure enough, she was able to do her internship. She lived with this individual, the old friend, had a wonderful time in New York because he was able to provide everything for her. And my patient didn't have to come up with anything virtually, and they had a wonderful time. And so that was his story. And generally when people hear these stories, like you mentioned with your son, or like we were talking about tonight, people will have stories of their own. Or they'll also have coincidences that they, again, like my organic chemistry book story, they didn't realize was more than just a coincidence. And so it's fun to have people relate those stories with those coincidences after they hear another story. So I think virtually everyone has had a story like that.
This is so true. This is so true. Now, did I read somewhere where you're working on your second book?
Well, I'm a crazy doctor here, so, one book isn't enough. I thought I'd do another one and maybe another one after that. It's the next one. I'm not sure. I'm collecting stories from docs, so if any docs are listening, I'd love to have them get to my website, which is physiciansuntoldsstories.com, and just let me know that they have a story, and I'll be glad to call them or whatever. But either it's going to be another doctor story book or a nurse with nurses. So nurses have some amazing stories, and they are in the trenches with the patients, especially the ICU nurses that are dealing with life and death situations all the time, and they have some amazingly wonderful stories about patients. And so I'd like to connect and do a book on either Nurses Untold Stories or another book on Physicians Untold Stories.
Very, very good, very good. And like you said, there's so many of them out there. You can probably have volume 1, 2, 3, 4. You could have a lot of different volumes because these stories, it's important to share these stories so people understand and see that there is so much more than we think. There's so much more that's out there. We have to really open our eyes and our hearts and our minds to what's truly out there. So this has been such a wonderful, wonderful hour. Can you please share with our listeners how they can find your book and how they can find out more about you and how they can get in touch with you?
Sure. The book's available primarily through Amazon, so they can log on to Amazon.com. It's available as a Kindle and also as a soft cover. Our website is physiciansuntoldsstories.com, and they can learn about me. There's some videos on there about some of the stories and a number of blog posts and lots of information about what we're doing. And we're hoping to start a movement that lets people know that there's something else out there. That doctors are spiritual individuals and that they can open up a dialogue. Be a little more open with your doctor and doctors with patients about spiritual things, because I think healing takes place not only with medicine but also with some spiritual help. And prayers are important. Watch for coincidences in your life. And that love is the force that seems to be the eternal force that is the strongest force in the universe. And I think that came across in the book also with the doctor stories.
That is so true. So true. So we have time for one more good, juicy story. So pick another story, one of your favorites from the book to share with our listeners.
Okay. One of my favorites is Graham O'Hanlon. Graham O'Hanlon was a little old lady that was a midwife until she had to retire. And she stepped into the room. Now, this is about Dr. Heitzler's wife. Dr. Heitzler is a doctor that actually delivered 2 of our kids. And Dr. Heitzler's wife was delivering their 5th child when little old Graham O'Hanlon stepped into the room and literally saved Joan's life. And the story goes that Graham O'Hanlon was a midwife in Chicago for a long time, retired and lived with Joan Heitzler and her mother. This was when Joan was a little girl. And she developed a great love, speaking of love, a great love for Joan. Joan and Grandma O'Hanlon had an unbelievable love for each other. And Joan used to say, if I could make it to Grandma O'Hanlon's lap one last time, that I knew I would, one time I'd know I'd be safe, because her mother would get mad at her or something, and she'd run to Grandma O'Hanlon's lap. And when Joan was delivering the baby, the baby was delivered, and then she had a lot of pain afterwards, and they were doing some procedures afterwards to make sure the placenta was all removed, and she asked for some pain medication. Well, in those days, they used Trilene, which is a mask that they put over the woman's face, administered the gas, which is Trilene, and they put the woman into a deep sleep. Well, no one realized that when Joan was, just before she went into labor, she'd eaten a very large meal. And when they were about ready to put the mask over Joan's face, Grandma O'Hanlon stepped into the room, stood at the foot of the bed, and shook her head. Don't take this Trilene. And so Joan pushed it away. And about 1 minute later, Joan vomited the entire meal that she'd eaten. Had she had the mask on, she would have aspirated that and may have died or developed a serious aspiration pneumonia. So Joan says that she made it to Grandma O'Hanlon's lap one last time, transcending time and eternity because of their love, since Grandma O'Hanlon had died 22 years before.
Wow. That's amazing. So, that's a wonderful story. I love how you mentioned that what you're starting with your books is a movement, because that is so true. I believe that we are living in very unique times where humanity, even as with all that's going on, in the world, I believe humanity is slowly but surely awakening up to the truth that you speak of in your book, that these are not coincidences, that there is much more out there. There's much more to who we are and what we're connected to. And I love the word that you use is a movement, because I started my show 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, and the mission is to inspire the world to awaken to the truth of oneness, because I do believe once mankind awakens, imagine if everybody woke up tomorrow morning knowing that you're connected to everyone else. All 7 billion of us are connected like cells, like little cells in a body, that you're all connected. And if everyone woke up with that knowing, it would put an end to war, it would put an end to crime, it would put an end to poverty instantly. All those things would be gone instantly. So I do believe that's where mankind is moving towards. And so just recently, I just published a new website. I'm a part of an alliance. It's called Universal Oneness Alliance. We just published the website last Friday, and it's Awake to Oneness Radio. It's Universal Unity, and it's Awakening Our Truth. These are 3 nonprofit organizations that have come together to form a Oneness Alliance, and so now we're also starting a movement. It's a Oneness
Caroline.
movement. Yes.
Good for you. Good for you.
And we'll be hosting, if anyone's interested, if anyone's in Victoria, but actually it doesn't matter where you're located, we're hosting our first live event September 3rd in Victoria, BC, Canada. And that live event will also be live streamed. So if anybody's interested, they can find out more by going to onennessalliance.org is the website. Brand new website.
Good for you.
Yes.
Good luck with that.
I'm very excited. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm very excited, and I do believe that we are, as a human family, moving towards love, because it all comes down to that one word. It's all about love.
It's the most powerful force in the universe, I think. Yes.
Yep. Very true, very true. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Scott. I enjoyed this so much, tremendously. I love having these conversations. That's why I started the show, just to have conversations like this to share with the world. And thank you so much. And I'm going to be looking.
It's been a pleasure.
I'm going to be looking for your next book.
Okay. I'll let you know when it comes out. It won't take 4 years, I don't think, this time.
Okay, yeah. And I just started my first, so let's see. It may be 4 years before my first one hits the bookshelves, but I started it on Mother's Day. I was inspired to start a book, and
that's
I started
great.
My first book, yes.
Good for you.
Thank you so much, so much. Enjoy the Memorial Day weekend. I can't believe it. I just realized just yesterday that this weekend is Memorial Day weekend. I'm like, it can't be already. It seems like the year just started. Yeah, it seems like it just started, and it's already Memorial Day. So enjoy your weekend. I appreciate so much you being our guest, and we'll keep in touch via email.
Great. Thanks, Caroline.
Thank you. Have a great weekend. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.